Hello, everybody.
Hey.
How are you? I'm Lacey Delane.
I'm Sonya Larrea.
And welcome to Rethinking Humanity Interviews. We are so excited to be live with you today. We have an awesome show for you. We're excited. We're excited to be here. Sonya, how are you? How have you been? What's going on?
No, I'm just doing what we're all doing every day, wearing my mask and social distancing, but excited about tonight. This is a great show.
Yeah, I'm excited for this one too. I feel you on the social distancing thing. It feels like we're kind of entering like March again, in a way, March, April again.
Yeah, definitely. Definitely.
Otherwise, other than masking up, everything else is good with you, huh?
Yeah, it's all good.
Good. Me too. I am getting used to masking up as well, and just this new kind of chapter we're in with COVID, which feels like a continued, the same thing. But you know what? I actually a couple of weeks ago was really excited because I was finally healthy enough to like be out and about a little bit and see my friends from soccer that I hadn't seen since like last October.
Yeah, I remember.
We played some pickup, and this has really slowed us down with the podcast.
Show everybody.
Broke my wrist, people. Oh my God, it sucks. So yeah, that's put us behind a bit.
But you're healing.
Yes, I'm healing, and I am thankful that it could have been way worse. So true. I'm super happy about that. So yeah, we're excited. We want to thank you guys for watching. We're excited about this new kind of spinoff of Rethinking Humanity. Our typical podcast, obviously, we don't do live on YouTube. We do through Anchor, which you can get on Spotify and pretty much all different platforms. And we just came out with our latest episode. Sonya, it was episode 5. You want to talk a little bit about it? We love for you guys to do that.
Oh, it was Having and Being, obviously Eric Fromm. We discussed the Old Testament and New Testament, and you definitely need to check it out. Go take it away, Lacey. Tell them why they need to check it out.
Here's why. If I don't do it as good as you, then you can do it, okay? But here's why. This episode tells you that the Old Testament tells you, and the New Testament tells you that it is very important for you to have a day off, to eat, to drink, to have sex, to play, to enjoy yourself, to have a chat. So I think that's enough of a motivation.
Yeah, listen to it. It's good. It's a good one.
But no, really. It's we're really proud of it. It's amazing to me how much the themes of the being mode of existence exist in so many different elements of life, of different religious writings as well. So we're excited to see that in the Old and New Testaments. So yeah, check that out, guys. So obviously today we have James Treakle with us. We're excited about that. We are going to be talking to him. He actually is a co-producer of Juice, which is a documentary about electricity. It's really good. Really good. We watched it a couple of days ago. Definitely check it out. You can get it on iTunes and Prime Video. So please participate, guys that are watching. And we're going to have some time at the end that is dedicated to questions if you guys are interested and you have them. So we're excited about that. So without further ado, let's bring in our guest, James Treakle.
Hey, everybody.
Hey, James.
Hi.
Good to have you.
Welcome. James, tell us where you're joining us from.
So I am here in Austin, Texas. I love it here. It's a little hot, but I mean, that's Texas for you. So yeah.
Yeah, it's humid. I was in Houston last summer and I was melting. It was bad.
Yeah, I'm glad I don't live in Houston. It's a little bit too big for me, and it's a little bit too humid for me. I mean, like, we're close to the ocean, but not that close, so I can tolerate that. Right.
I thought it was humid in Georgia before I came to Texas.
No, I grew up in Texas. It's humid there.
Yeah. So, James, tell us a little bit about yourself before we kind of get into our theme, which is workism. tell us a little bit about yourself. You have a lot of stuff going on. You've got a podcast that I think is awesome. You did this movie Juice, which we watched, is awesome. And then of course this Workism video. So go for it. Have at it.
So I am a filmmaker. I'm a writer. I dabble in all kinds of creative stuff, but filmmaking is what I do for a living. And I've been doing that for, in one capacity or another, I've been doing it for about 12 years now. I've been really making money doing it for about 5, going on 6. So I grew up in the Midwest, where there is no real film industry to speak of, in Indiana, at least. There's a little bit here and there, and, the other states around it. But in Indiana, it's been, a film industry desert for a long time. And I always knew that's what I wanted to do. I love the movies. I love just the magical experience, the surreal, dreamlike storytelling. And I wanted to direct, like everybody wants to be the next Steven Spielberg. That was me. I copped to that. But I ended up kind of finding my way into editing. And I still do other things, but editing is my main gig. And editing is mostly what I did on Juice, How Electricity Explains the World, which is a documentary that I helped work on for 3 years. And the production went all over the world. They went to India, Iceland, Lebanon, Puerto Rico, California, New York, all over. And it was an incredible experience, because this documentary really reframes, especially for us as Americans, the way you think about energy consumption, the way you think about electricity, because, we just take for granted that you can get up at any time and turn on a light, like, oh, well, maybe your light bulb is out, and that's like the worst you can hope. Or maybe you didn't pay your energy bill if you're poor, but even that is like a very marginal amount. Imagine being somebody who has a comparatively middle-class existence in, say, Lebanon, and you just flat out, in Beirut, in the developed areas, you do not have 24-hour electricity. You have to deal with diesel generator cartels in order to get the equivalent of 24-hour electricity. So you end up paying 2 electric bills. And this is a topic that it's easy for it to become academic, because we tend to think of this in terms of economics and, big numbers and yada, yada, yada. It's all this kind of like, UN global development kind of thing, right? It's like, it's hard to see the human side of that. And for us making the film, which was directed by Tyson Culver and produced by Robert Bryce, who is also an author and journalist who has been covering the energy business for decades. We wanted to tell the human story of electricity. We wanted to really bring it home, why it's important. And for me, at first, it was just a gig. It's like, oh, well, I'm working with this guy, Tyson, and some other projects. And then, he was like, hey, I've been working on this documentary. And can you help me, cut up some of these interviews? It was very early on. And I was just really sucked in immediately by how passionate some of these voices were about the human side of this topic. And so that's why I eventually became a co-producer of the film, because in the documentary editing process, there's a lot of give and take. And I ended up kind of taking this on as like a personal project. This became more than a gig for me.
Wow.
This became something that I felt like really reflected things that I already really deeply cared about human development and human rights. And so the film is a very merciful, 90 minutes long. It is quick. It's not dry. It's not, like, all due respect to Ken Burns, but it's not a PBS documentary. It's
powerful. It's powerful.
And it's something that you can watch with your family. It's like, this is, it's educational, it's emotional, it's informative. And, I think everybody can enjoy it and learn something.
Yeah, I think particularly, we can empathize. It can help us to be able to empathize more with others. It's incredible to me how much we do take electricity for granted. I mean, in the film, it's like, kids who don't have electricity, they can't go to college because they can't study, because the layers just keep going. to it. So it is incredible. And I mean, that seems like, coming from watching that, it's like, okay, electricity seems to be a basic human right at this point.
Yes.
Right. It was amazing how they had to plan their life around when the electricity was on, and it affected their work and their health and so many aspects that, like you're saying, we take for granted.
Yeah. And I know that, a good number of the listeners to this podcast are going to be people who care about universal basic income. And that, to me, it dovetails with it's the same logic for why electricity should be a human right, why a basic income should be a human right, or a right of citizenship, however you want to frame it. It's the same, same argument, because if you don't have your basic needs met, if you can't read at night, then you can't educate yourself. If you can't, do the dishes, then you don't have enough time in the day. If you can't have basic sanitation, which is usually electrified in some way, if you can't cook indoors without having to use biofuel, which can make you sick, then all the, aspects of your life begin to deteriorate. And it's the same thing if you don't have money. Access to just basic resources. Going into the 21st century, we're going to need to get electricity to every human being on the planet. Because right now there's somewhere in the neighborhood of basically 3 billion people that don't have the electricity access that we have. And when you think about the number of people that don't have any electricity at all, it's actually close to 1 billion, if I recall correctly.
That was amazing. Wow.
Yeah. Which, we think about it, we have all this incredible technology at our fingertips here in the States. We really do take that for granted. There are people that live in the dark. They live in what is almost a primordial kind of existence compared to us. And we need to get them electrified as quickly as possible. And there's a number of different technologies we can use to solve those problems. So energy poverty, from a human rights perspective, is as big a problem as climate change or any other global issue.
And I also like the part where they discussed if you had to choose between dirty energy and no energy, we're going to pick the dirty energy. So there's the climate aspect of that.
That's right.
Absolutely. Yeah. And there's the iron law of climate, right? That Roger Pilkey Jr., he makes the argument late in the film that if you have to choose between economic growth and, and reaching like a climate goal, you're going to choose economic growth because you want to improve your material circumstances. So we're forcing people into this choice in which, of course, they're going to choose fossil fuels. Of course, they're going to choose these dirtier forms of energy because the alternative is poverty, right? And we need to eliminate that. And that's through a mix of energy technologies. There's no one size fits all approach. It's a mix of nuclear and renewables, and even natural gas has done a lot to decarbonize the economy. It's not perfect and has lots of issues with fracking, et cetera, but it is much, much cleaner than the next best thing, right? So we need to be getting natural gas into places where coal is currently, and we need to get renewables where renewables make sense, because those technologies have been kind of overhyped. I don't want to, crap on renewables too much, because they do have their place. But, we definitely need nuclear, though, as a dense electricity baseline that then makes things like renewables even more viable, because you have a stable grid and you can help offset any remaining fossil fuels that are in your energy mix using renewables. So,
yeah, I mean, I think one of the things that I walked away from the film realizing is that not only do we need to do nuclear, which I'm a believer in, but we need to do it all, and we need to do it yesterday, but we need to do it as soon as possible. And it's just like, the climate crisis. When you're in a crisis, you got to use every single resource you can. And this is a crisis, a human crisis for people who can't get electricity. And so we need to use every resource. And it's amazing to me how much more efficient and how much less is necessary for nuclear to work. That was pretty cool to see the comparison between like the natural, the windmills, and then nuclear.
That was good. Yeah.
Yeah.
So
it's worth noting one final note on nuclear there. So we visited the Indian Point nuclear power plant in New York, and that plant has since shut down since we went there. And if you look at the amount of energy share that went towards that plant, has now been, if I recall correctly, it's been almost entirely replaced by natural gas and coal. So we stepped backwards towards our carbon targets in the name of the environment. It's kind of, it's hard to justify. Yes, Indian Point was an older reactor and needed to be updated, but advanced nuclear in particular, we need to be subsidizing that. We need to be investing in it as a country, because getting nuclear up and running can be expensive, but it will last much longer than fossil fuels. And if you consider the environmental cost of using other forms of energy, whether it's through land use with renewables, which is one of the major drawbacks of those, or if it's through carbon with carbon-based fuels, then nuclear is the clear choice in many cases, especially for dense urban areas.
Yeah, and I mean, I think thorium, I don't know if it was mentioned specifically in the film, but I think that's also something that many people haven't considered, and I think it's a great option for us.
Yeah.
Well, it's educational. Everyone needs to check it out.
I love it. Yes, very good. That's I love documentaries, man. That's my life. If I'm watching something, it's a documentary. So tell us, James, about your podcast, the Normal People podcast, and anything else before we dive too much into a Workism.
So I started a YouTube channel, Treakle Up, which is based on my name being a pun with the trickle up economics of Andrew Yang, and so I and some of my friends were quarantined, were bored, and we wanted to talk about politics, and so we started the Normal People podcast, which we were doing weekly. Now we're doing it more bi-weekly. We've been interrupted a few times. You know how it is.
Yes, I do.
You do your best. But it's a good time because, our premise is that we're not experts. We're just normal people. We're just, weighing in from our perspective is, we're all people that, are from Indiana who are on the, originally at least, who are on the podcast. And, we're just trying to tackle these topics, whatever is in the news, cultural trends, anything from UFOs to, I don't know, conspiracy theories to whatever. It's not all fringy stuff, but, we cover fringy stuff. And I mean, we just try to have a frank conversation. That's pretty much the long and short of it.
I listened to a little bit of the one on social media, which I think was interesting. And again, that's a conversation we could have for hours about the good and the bad and the effect. Yeah, that was a depressing podcast to do because the more you research into social media, which I have a bunch of books on it now, and it's just like, why am I even on this thing? But then, that's where, you go to stay connected and be informed. And, it's kind of a catch-22. But
I would listen to the one on, I think it was the police brutality. There's one on the police. That was good. Yes. Yeah. Cool. So you do a lot of current topics, obviously. Yeah. Try to stay current. Try to weigh in. People are waiting with bated breath to hear what we have to say. So we got to deliver our authoritative statement. We know how that feels.
We totally get that. We got so many people waiting to hear from us. Let me tell you. Cool. Well, also the Workism video. Now I saw this. You did this, I think, in April. Is that right? You put this out?
Right. That sounds right.
Okay. Yeah. I remember seeing it and being in the midst of, coronavirus and all that good stuff, and just not having the capacity, but thinking, oh my God, we got to talk to James. So he's going to be perfect for the podcast. So we're going to play the first 45 seconds of it for everybody right now. Just get an idea of it. It's about 5 minutes. I think it's had over 1,000 views at this point. But just take a look and we're going to talk about it.
If any would not work, neither should he eat. St. Paul the Apostle wrote these words 2,000 years ago. We've been living and dying by them ever since. Whether you're a capitalist or a socialist, St. Paul's commandment is sacrosanct. It's the foundation of the labor theory of value. The American Puritans held to it. So did Vladimir Lenin. This one verse, part of the Western world's Christian DNA, has evolved into a secular religion, Workism. And make no mistake, it is ideology, faith wearing the vestments of economic theory. We must all dance for our dinner.
Yep.
Okay, so there it is. So I love it. Workism falls so much in line with the being mode of existence versus the having mode of existence. And, it just fits in so well with what Erich Fromm talks about. So tell us a little bit just about what motivated you to make the video, how you got the concept for it, that kind of thing.
So a aspect of my background that I don't talk about that often is that I studied to be a Christian minister. And it didn't work out, clearly, because it's not what I do. But it's being, a devout evangelical Christian was a huge part of my life for, my first 18 or so years. And I was such a diehard that my pastor paid for me to go to ministry school. And so I was the young, upstart, loudmouth wonderkind who had an opinion about everything in regards to, Christianity and church history and, doctrine and dogma and yada, yada. So I had an interesting experience, though, because my family didn't start out as evangelicals. We started out Eastern Orthodox and eventually found our way through a number of different denominations to the one that I went to school in. And this kind of eclectic upbringing gave me a unique perspective on Christianity and its influence on the culture. Because the thing that got me in trouble in ministry school, and the reason why it didn't work out, is because I liked reading into the deep texture of culture and history and the way that all these things shaped the faith and the way the faith then in turn shaped culture and history. And that led to some uncomfortable conversations about certain things in the Bible that, to me, especially having a background in which, as an Eastern Orthodox Christian, you have more than 66 books in the Bible. You have, if I recall correctly, it's 78. So that, the idea that the Bible was just like it fell out of the sky as a divinely ordained document was already something that I rejected, because I knew that that's not true. And that's something that some aspects of Christianity, some traditions within Christianity regularly acknowledge that, like, oh, of course, the church is the ultimate authority. We put this document together. Theoretically, we could change it whenever we want, but that's not the perspective of the evangelicals, in part because they're coming in America really from this Puritan tradition. And this is where Workism comes in, because what Workism really is this sacrificial kind of covenant. And covenant theology is huge in Puritanism. It's Calvinism. You have a covenant with God, just like, Israel had a covenant, the believers, the church has a covenant with God, and you have to continually prove your worth through this kind of sacrifice. This is a paradox because it's occurring simultaneous to this predestination, that you are either damned from the beginning of time or you are predestined to be saved from the beginning of time. But you don't know, as the individual believer, which one you are. And so in order for you to prove to yourself ultimately that you're one of the elect, you have to prove that you're holy by working really hard, by sacrificing in a Christ-like way, right? So it creates this incentive, and this is something that, sociologists have been talking about forever. I mean, like, you have like Max Weber's, Protestantism and the spirit of capitalism, this idea that you have to be industrious. That's where your personal value comes from. That's where your holiness comes from. I mean, it's everywhere in our culture, but it has this, implication to it, which is that if you don't work, you don't deserve to live. You don't deserve the basic necessities. And so it is something that flies in the face of the small L liberal conception of human rights, that people have innate human rights, that every human being deserves, the right to life. And that means, food, water, shelter, things like electricity in the 21st century, all those kinds of things should be given to us because we're human beings and for no other reason. Well, to the Puritans, it's like, well, but if you're one of the damned, God doesn't love you anyway. Why would we provide for you? We'll just cast you out of the community if you can't carry your weight. And so human life doesn't really have that inherent value. And so these two things, this universal human rights belief set and this puritanical belief set, have kind of been growing up like wheat and tares, to use another biblical kind of illusion, in American culture, right? So like, to understand why we're so confused about our relationship to work, I think, is by we hold these two beliefs kind of subconsciously simultaneously, and they're in conflict with one another. And I think it explains a lot of the anxiety that we deal with of like, well, I feel like, yeah, of course I have inherent value, and of course everybody does, but you also have this sort of like gut sense that like I could always be doing more, and maybe everybody else is like lazy and they're kind of slacking off, but I won't. I'll work harder, right? And like that kind of like suspicion of your fellow human being is everywhere in the culture, and this is why you have people who will work themselves to death, and we need to be moving away from directly confronting this workism, because a lot of the things, honestly, that people blame on capitalism are really other aspects of human nature or other beliefs that kind of coexist with our current economic system. It's like capitalism isn't perfect, but workism is not capitalistic. Strictly speaking, it doesn't have any work mandate. Labor is just something that's part of the economic theory, but it's not like you must work or else you should die. Like, that's not in capitalism. That's workism. That's a separate thing. And if anything, has a more direct relationship with the kind of classical Marxist-Leninist model of socialism, where, I mean, the old anecdote is that like you could walk into like a fish shop somewhere in Soviet Russia and there would be 3 people working the counter doing the job of 1 person, because work is just supposed to be good. Like, the symbol is the hammer and sickle. Like, this is explicitly not just about labor rights, but about labor itself being a dignifier. If you don't work, you don't deserve that dignity, right? And part of the reason why the bourgeoisie are treated with such contempt is because they don't work. Well, they're like leeches. They need to be destroyed, not just because they're rich and powerful and corrupt, of course, but that's almost like it's because they don't work that they are rich and corrupt. And they are leeching off of our labor, and that makes them less than human, and that justifies this kind of behavior, right? This like violent, revolution, as opposed to a democratic, a series of, controlled reforms that respect human rights. And so, and that's very different, I think, from like the modern forms of socialism that we're seeing, that like I critique them all the time, but they're not necessarily as reliant on this workism kind of, conception. More of them are based on a liberal view of human rights being universal, as that being the point, right? And so, but it's something that we need to be explicit about, because it's pernicious. It's already there, and if we're not careful, it can grow up and become like, oh, well, and honestly, you even kind of see it in the like, well, Jeff Bezos makes like, $10 billion a second or some whatever number that somebody, brings up. I don't know where they get those numbers, honestly, but it's like, a second without lifting a finger. And you can kind of feel the puritanical contempt in there. And I'm not saying that I don't personally have some sense of contempt for, Jeff Bezos for being Jeff Bezos and being a dick. But all that, aside, I think we need to be careful about the language that we use, because these belief systems are part of the background radiation of our culture now. We need to be talking about them. We need to be directly confronting them and setting up something new to replace them. It's not enough to just criticize workism. We have to make an explicit replacement. Like, this is the ideology that we want. We want something that treats human beings with innate dignity and that provides for all your basic needs, and then rewards labor, because labor does have value. over and above that, or talent, or whatever. But like, you should not feel like you don't belong in America unless you can, quote, work hard. Like, the reason why immigrants coming to America is a good thing is because they're people, not because they're hard workers. And I think that is even some in well-intentioned discord about immigrants. Like, oh, but immigrants are great because they work really hard. It's like, immigrants are great because they're people and they're bringing their culture and their lives and entrusting us with them. So we should respect them because they're human beings, not because of all the things that they could do for us, right? Like, it's a very otherizing kind of thing. Workism kind of has its fingers in all kinds of pies, and we could get into that later.
Let me ask you a question, James. So I look at, when you talk about workism and you relate it to Christianity or going to actually even biblical scripture, what about the other aspect of in scripture, something that Lacey and I touched upon in our last podcast? There's a lot of language, like in Exodus, I'm sure you know, Matthew, where they talk about you don't need to do anything to receive, and that we're also looking at the last is the first, and the humility. Why do we lose those aspects when we're looking at Christianity and workism?
So I hate to sound like, a Catholic trad or something like that on Twitter, but I blame Protestantism. And the reason being is because it removes the historical context, and in the biblical context, it creates this kind of Mad Libs version of Christianity where, like, well, Martin Luther made executive decisions about what he felt like what was most important in scripture and disregarded church tradition, which, church tradition has its own problems. But it's also a corpus that contains within itself the ability to moderate, and did over time. There was a counter-reformation. And each of the kind of high church traditions that have a more kind of structured approach to the development of doctrine have been able to reconcile some of these differences between, the kind of workist tendencies within scripture and the really, it's kind of a sacrament of the Sabbath, like this idea of you don't need to work, and like that and I quote it in the Workism essays, like, I desire mercy, not sacrifice, and that was specifically related to the Sabbath in the in the context of that original passage, because Jesus was quoting from, I think it was Hosea, and the long and short of it is that when you have a split between these different denominations, you end up with Calvinism being this very works-based, regimented. God in the Calvinist cosmology is very cruel and capricious, and he's not going to tell you his plan. He decides who to save and who to damn, and you can't argue with him. And like in predestination had been something that had been argued to death in other church traditions, and they eventually kind of came up with a synthesis that made it kind of make sense and not make God into a huge monster. But all that kind of got thrown out with the Protestant Reformation, and removed all that ecclesiastical literature that had helped people make sense of that, at least theologically. And since that was gone, now these things can kind of rage unchecked. So, within the Bible, because it was written by human beings, you're going to have all these different competing interests and ideas. And with nothing to contain that, because, really, I think the fact that there are, there's tens of thousands of denominations of Protestant Christianity versus, a handful of splinter sects of Catholics and Orthodox, I think that the high church, like the church as the authority groups within Christianity, were vindicated. If you don't have the church setting the rules, anybody gets to decide whatever they want out of the Bible is more important than any other thing. If you're in a church in which somebody decides to just preach workism, that is gospel, literally. And it's hard to fight that without just leaving and starting your own denomination. What's your recourse? You're both interpreting the Bible, right? You're both being led by the Holy Spirit. And so it leads down this very divisive, chaotic path.
So the takeaway is you're saying that the Protestant part of this took those, that theme and took it into workism. Because if you're looking at biblical scripture, again, you're looking at anti-greed, anti-ego, and it does not seem to fit. I think that's one of the challenges we have today with people that have left the church, is they're saying, wait a minute, this doesn't fit my value system, if this is what Christianity is about. if this is
Right. Yeah, it opened the door to new kinds of Christianity that don't resemble the historical faith in any really meaningful sense. Like you kind of like, honestly, I have a lot of respect for Mormons, because to me it's like it's the natural endpoint of being Protestant. Is it like, well, why not just add your own New Testament? Like, here's an additional testament. Why not? And it's like it's Bible fan fiction, because Protestantism is kind of that anyway. Like King James cut out books he didn't like because they were too Jewish. True story. That's why I went from 78 books to 66. And so now you have a whole other section that have been like either decanonized or kind of shunted off into like weird, ambiguous territory. And those things are all just products of, the evolution of this religion to something new. I mean, like the Protestant ethos is very different. It has unleashed all kinds of new strains of this. And so it's part of the problem of like referring to American Christianity. It's like, well, what do I really mean when I say that? Right? Like, is it the Calvinist one? Is it the Arminian one? Is it the high church Catholic one? Is it one that's like, incorporating Jewishness into it? Is it one that's like kind of anti-Semitic and afraid of the Jewish, and there are infinite ways to read the Bible. And that is the problem, is that the Bible is a Rorschach test, and the Bible needs a context of a living community. And this is something that, even speaking of the Jewishness within the Jewish religion, this is critical to it. This is why you have not only the Torah, but you have all the rabbinical texts. You cannot just read the Torah and understand what it's supposed to say. You have to read all the rabbinical literature that's grown up around it to understand it. And this is also true within Islam, is that you have, and this is why there's a separation between the fundamentalist Muslims and the Muslims who are more moderate or more liberal, because the ones who are more moderate and more liberal are reading all this other literature that's grown up around the Quran. It's not just you just read the Quran, and if you read any other thing, then you are being defiled in some way. It's like, no, you're supposed to read all the other tradition around it to give context for it. That's like, this is like the beginning of wisdom, and then everything else around it is what shapes this ever evolving relationship that we have with this text and with our faith. And that's true of every major Abrahamic religion, including Baha'i, except for Protestant Christianity. It's the only one that doesn't do that. And notably, it's the most splintered, it's the most chaotic, and it's the most selfish. Really, really mean to Protestants right now, but I was one, so I'm allowed. And I think, it's part of the reason why we have these contradictory things where like people feel like it's really important for them to vote for Donald Trump to protect their faith. It's like, that doesn't make any sense from a traditional Christian point of view, right? But from a Protestant point of view, it can make perfect sense. And that's what's so damn irrational about it. It's really hard to fight.
Yeah. Well, also you think about, go ahead, Lacey, sorry.
No, go ahead.
No, I was thinking about how people have pulled away from religion, but at the same time, workism is sort of a secular form of a kind of a religion of saying, we've got to work 80 hours a week. This is who we are. And it's infiltrated really the psyche of how we view ourselves.
Yeah, it really has. And I think that's true of a lot of things within Christianity in particular have kind of become, like the theology itself, or like the moral implications of those various theologies have become part of the cultural fabric of America, or the West generally, but America in particular. And I think you can really feel it in the tension between the United States and like its immediate neighbors. And this is something I've thought about a lot. It's like, well, one of the main reasons why there is so much enmity with Mexico, it's like, yeah, there's a racial component to that, but it's not just that. It's also because Mexico is culturally Catholic and we are culturally Protestant.
Yeah.
And honestly, that is more important than the racial component from a historical point of view. That is why there's so much tension, because it's this whole different worldview It's like to the Protestants, the Catholics are living in a world of superstition and magic, and it's this very kind of otherized kind of thing. Whereas Protestantism is individualistic and rational, and that's those kind of cultural tropes then become secularized. So what you see in Latin American culture and South American culture, because so much of it was, it kind of imprinted with Catholicism, with the colonial activity, is this sense of community and transcendence, all these things that are really at odds with the individualism and the kind of, fragmented nature of American society, where it's kind of every man for himself, right?
Yeah.
But the every man for himself thing is perfectly Puritan, because if you don't know if you're saved or you're damned, it really is you against everybody else, because you just have to focus on yourself. You got to prove to yourself, or else live in anxiety forever, that you're one of the elect. That is, your priority number one, and everybody else, well, God either saved them or he damned them. It's none of your business. You can't control any of it. There's no point, whatever. Just worry about yourself, right? And hence why we are where we are.
Exactly.
Well, it's so interesting, because when we first talked to you, James, I remember asking you this question, like, how did you even come to a place where you're going to do a video on workism? And I totally did not expect you to say anything about religion, much less that you were super religious at one point. I also was. And I think it's so ironic in a lot of ways that we can tie so much back to this Puritanistic religious ideology. And I think it's incredible how much we don't realize it. Like, we're just living on autopilot in this world that is exactly set up because of that. And we could be living in a way that's much happier, but we don't. And we don't even question. Like, we're not even thinking about why this has happened. We're just like, yeah, that's just how it is.
Yeah. We are swimming in it, right? It's ambient, and it's just like we take a lot of our blessings for granted. I think we take a lot of our problems for granted. We think that they're kind of universal. There's a sense of, like, when we export American culture, we export our cultural assumptions, and that is definitely something that we're seeing that in kind of like the way that we talk about everything from work to race, etc. We're very eccentric in the way that we think about a lot of these core issues, and yet we treat them like they're universal conflicts, because they are theological in their tenor, and we just don't realize it. We've been growing up in it. We've been ingesting it, uncritically, and these things are theologies, and we just, haven't yet woken up to the fact that they are.
Yeah, when we talked to you the other day, a term you used that really struck me, resonated with me, was brutal individualism. I thought that was a great word to describe where we're at. And what I think's happened now with COVID and everything is all of these issues are accelerated. We're kind of face to face with these things that you're saying we've been living with. And it's sort of status quo. And now we're seeing, pulling the curtain back.
Yeah. Oh, completely. I mean, like, it's not a coincidence that we're having this racial justice moment on the heels of our economy and our human value really coming into question, right? Because all those things are tied together, and they have been from the beginning.
Well, that's a perfect segue to race, which is something that, again, blew me out of the water when we had our initial conversation, that this is also tied to religion as well. And can you talk a little bit about that? Because this just blew my mind.
So, and I had mentioned Calvinism earlier, and this idea of predestination, and that really you have two classes of human being. You have the saved and the damned, sheep and the goats, right? The elect and everybody else. And when you had the growth of the slave trade, I mean, because slavery is as old as humanity, unfortunately. But the specific kind of slavery that we saw, the chattel slavery that we saw, the Dutch and the British engaging in particular, that kind of slavery required a theological justification for its cruelty. And if you were dealing with people that you could justify to yourself as being like, I don't have to worry about treating them like a Christian brother. I don't have to worry about treating them like a member of my tribe, and because their life is valueless to me. Well, predestination is a very convenient way to do it. It's not the only way that was done, but it was definitely a key way that it was done, especially for the Dutch, which were highly Calvinistic. I mean, there's a reason why, South Africa was in its apartheid, explicitly apartheid mode for so long, in part because they had this very strongly divided, whites versus everyone else culture. And we have that too, from a mix of various different cultural strains, but mainly, it is that puritanical sense of like, well, I don't have to worry about these Africans, because these Africans, as you can see, are from, clearly they have the mark of Cain. It's on their skin, right? So all of a sudden the color becomes, it's like skin color is one of those things that like, it could be like hair color. It could be like eye color. It's just a physical feature. It's not predictive of behavior or anything else. Like biologically, the more that we understand about genes and the way that they're distributed, the more readily apparent it is that like eugenics and all those kinds of things are hilariously misguided, because race doesn't exist. There are distributions of population, right, that have some traits that are shared in common. Like obviously, if like you're all on the same continent and these are the only people to sleep with, people will start to cluster certain traits. But those traits are infinitesimal in difference compared to any other group. Like we haven't had nearly enough time to evolve into like anything approaching a real race in a biological sense. It's just, humans spread out super fast over the past, 10 to 30,000 years, right? So, evolution just isn't that fast. And what we have instead is these folk races, these false conceptions of difference. And they are loaded with theological implications, with, the term is racial essentialism, that like, if you look at somebody, you can tell something about their character, their spiritual nature. And that soup is what we've been swimming in. And that, the pithy way that I describe this is that the belief in race is racism. Racism, like workism, is an ideology. And this is something that's like, we're at a moment like there's a lot of conversation about like critical theory. Maybe there's things that are wrong with it. And critical theory is a very broad umbrella. So I'm not going to defend all critical theory, but one of the key insights from within critical theory is this idea of social construction. And that's just that, and this is something that's readily apparent to anybody who's looking, is that certain ideas are created to the advantage of some people over others. It's something that occurs in religion. It's something that occurs in politics. When it comes to the concepts of gender, everything, right? And like that doesn't mean that everything is a discourse of power necessarily. Like there's reductive ways that can be used, but it's also a useful tool. And one of the most useful things to recognize is that the things that we treat as being real tend to kind of become salient or real to us psychologically, but those things are illusions. And we are basically living in the matrix in this country, where we have created this fake racial binary of whites, everyone else. And genetically, that's not even true.
Right.
I'm going to bring out one of my favorite books here because I have to plug.
Okay, cool.
Yay,
Twitter. Okay, this book is called Racecraft, and it was written by Karen Fields and Barbara Fields, and they are mother and daughter. It's great. And it's Racecraft, the Soul of Inequality in American Life. This was blurred by Ta-Nehisi Coates, so it's the thing.
Cool.
And this book is incredibly underrated. Let's see, when did this come out? I think it's like 2013, something like that. It's been out for years. Everybody needs to read this book. It's not a hard read.
Can you say Racecraft?
Racecraft.
Okay, I'm gonna see if we can get Victor to pop it up on the screen for us. Cool. Go ahead. Sorry,
that'd be great. So, one of the things that they talk about very early on, 2014, there we go. I wasn't that far off. One of the things that they talk about very early on is that genetically, we have this huge blended mix of different descents ethnically in America. And like, you literally can't actually tell by looking at somebody and the color of their skin whether they have African ancestry or European ancestry or not. And that is one of those things that's kind of mind-blowing to people because they're so used to using the fiction of race to explain descent of like, well, obviously you're more African because your skin is darker. For people who are, especially people who are descendants of slaves, Americans descended from slaves in the United States, you could have more European DNA than African DNA, but you just happen to have this dominant skin pigmentation gene. And so therefore everybody thinks of you as being more African than whatever. And like, and those things, those kinds of conceptions, they not only otherize, they kind of create this weird field of distortion that covers up all kinds of other problems. One of the reasons why they use the term racecraft is that the Salem witch trials, again, going back to the Puritans, this was a way to deal with the kind of anxieties that were existing in the culture at the time. And it was easier to blame this supernatural force, these witches, for all the misfortune that the colonies were going through at the time than to deal with the material world that they didn't fully understand, or with the anxieties that their own culture, being Calvinistic, being very desperate in its mood all the time, was creating. I mean, like, so the suicide rate was pretty high among Puritans, especially men, because of this pressure to prove that you were righteous. And if you were like the man of the house, I mean, like, people would just go walk into the woods and disappear, you know?
Wow.
Because the pressure was so intense to prove that you were a man of God, right? And similarly, like, they go through all these historical instances of, like, you see race is this way for Americans to kind of create this sort of, theological conflict between these two binary forces without having to deal with the class inequities that are ultimately at root of so many of these things. And this is something that even like the Confederates were explicitly trying to do. They explicitly set poor whites against blacks because they felt that it was important to keep the poor whites in their place, even more important than even keeping their slaves in their place, because there was more poor whites. If the poor whites got hip to what was going on, how they were being exploited by the slave owners, they would overturn slavery, and they would overturn this empire that the Confederacy wanted to build. Because the Confederacy didn't just want to split off, they wanted to conquer South America. That was their goal, because they had this manifest destiny. To them, manifest destiny never ended. They wanted to take over the world and turn it into this new empire of Christendom. And that was the language that they used. You can read the speeches that people were giving on the Senate floor, even prior to the Confederacy actually splitting off.
Wow.
That's what they wanted. And that theological kind of conception of race is still with us. It's something that it's disturbing to me when we talk about anti-racism, that we don't, kind of like with workism, we haven't really decided where we want to land when we're done with this. It's like, we all know that there's a problem with the way that we treat people based on the color of their skin. But then we end up kind of reinforcing racial categories. Instead of obliterating them, we end up reinforcing them. It's something that James Baldwin bemoaned, that he talked about the fact that, like, well, part of the reason why we can't get rid of this is that white people still think they're white. And what he meant by that is that, like, well, nobody's white, nobody's black. They don't exist. And unless we have an explicit renunciation of these things, we're not going to get anywhere.
So I love this idea. So let's say you take that away, and I love that you're saying that race is racist. So if we eliminate that thought or that language, then are we looking at basically the social construct? I mean, actually, to have these discussions with people, it's one of the things they use is these terminologies that we're all accustomed to, race. So
Right.
what are our alternatives, you know?
Well, I think this is something that we've like edged up to before. And that you saw it like when there was that push to like stop saying black, you know, start saying African American.
Yeah.
And now we've kind of backslid. It's really odd, right? And I think the reason being is that we imposed African American, but we never hyphenated the European Americans. It just became like, you know, if you didn't have like a strong attachment to being like an Irish American or whatever, you were just a white American. And so we never got rid of race. It was still there, right? And because the white category is kind of like the taproot of this whole thing, unless you get rid of that, everything stays. Like we didn't actually get rid of it. We just came up with a second term to call another group of people that may not actually all be of that descent. That's something that they also talk about in racecraft, is that technically there's a distinction between Afro-American and African-American from an ethnic point of view. Because if you're African American and the way that they conceive of it, you're probably somebody who's like, oh, well, you literally immigrated from Africa, like you're Nigerian, right? And you moved to America and naturalized, and now you're an African American. But obviously your experience and your ethnicity and your culture is going to be profoundly different from somebody who, you know, is descended from slaves here, or has just kind of like being sort of merged into the general cultural sphere of being an American, right? And so all these things are incredibly blurry. And what you see happening is that like the government is creating more categories. And so we are seeing greater and greater balkanization of Americans, but you still have the racial categories on there.
Right.
And to
That's
me,
the first thing that came to my mind was like, why do we still have race on this stuff?
It doesn't make any sense, because it's like, well, I'm trying to be an ethical human being, and I'm trying to internalize what somebody, you know, a great anti-racist writer is saying to me as a person who looks white, and saying that, look, you have to realize you're not white. I'm saying, okay, I'm not white. I don't check that box on the census anymore. I actually just write in American, because to me, that's my ethnicity. That's the only thing I've ever known. Like, I don't identify with the British side of my family. That was literally hundreds of years ago. Like, that's not something that's important to me, or the Swedish side. It's like, I know where I'm descended from, European, but that's not my culture. My culture is American. And that is true of the overwhelming majority of people who live here, no matter what they look like or sound like, right? Is that, I mean, you could be somebody who lives in Texas and is like, you know, you got the beautiful, you know, brown Hispanic skin, the whole deal, but you are adamant that you are a Texan, you are an American, and like those people, I love running into those people, because it really kind of overturns these assumptions we have about what an American looks like. Yeah. And I think that there is absolutely a mode in which even like well-intentioned liberals are walking around with a default view of American in their head that is a white man. And we need to get rid of that. That is the first thing that needs to go. It's like, what does being an American mean? Well, like, there's a great book, another one I want to recommend, called Call Me American. And if we could throw that up on the screen as well, that'd be great. So Call Me American is about this Somali immigrant and his story growing up in Somalia as the Civil War was beginning. And he wanted more than anything to be American. When before everything kind of fell apart and the place where he lived, yeah, there it is. He saw American. Yeah, thank you, Victor. You're doing great. He saw American action movies, and he listened to American music. So everything from like country to rap to rock and all those things. No matter who was making, whether they looked white or black or whatever, they were American to him. And he never thought, oh, because I look like Somali, that therefore I can't be American. Because the values that he got from American movies were anybody can be American.
Interesting.
It doesn't, and because a lot of the movies that he was watching were made in the 80s, and this was like, you know, white guy and black guy shooting bad guys, like working together. They're equals. They're a team. You know, like it's 48 Hours. It's, you know, it's Predator. It's whatever. Like all these different movies with these, you know, quote mixed race casts, and like the the message that he got was that like, oh, being an American doesn't, like, well, in Somalia, everybody kind of looks like each other. Like in America, it's not the case. You can just look like whatever. And that was attractive to him. And that it's like, it's really easy to be down on America. And like, we're, mainly in this conversation, criticizing a lot of these major issues with American culture, but that's just like the wheat and the chaff. Going back to that metaphor, that is also part of our cultural export, is this idea that race is a fiction, that it doesn't matter. And it's like, there's been a lot of criticism of like being, colorblind or whatever. And like, I understand why people are critical of that concept, because right now with all the issues that are going on, you can't just pretend it's not happening.
Right.
And
right.
That's not what I'm advocating for at all. I'm advocating for a deliberate, explicit merging of our identities into one identity. It can either be, let's decide that we're going to be ethnically American, or if we decide like, you know what, we live in a global culture, maybe it's time to move past that. Cool. Then let's all just identify as being human,
Yeah, I love that.
Honestly, whatever people decide on is cool with me, because it beats what we're currently doing.
Yeah.
I
agree. What I want to touch on is that you're talking about the other. So when you brought up the fact of the witches in Salem, or even like immigrants, I think what happens in our culture is that we're finding someone, or you brought up the poor whites in the era of slavery. There's like someone to blame for the issues, or someone to look at, you're taking my job, or you're bringing down the country. And that's like an easy way to scapegoat and not look at us as humans, or, as you're saying, Americans.
Yeah, absolutely. It's, we have all this anxiety. It's a way to deal with it without having to deal with the material causes of the anxiety, right? And so that's why, for me too, it's like I was really attracted to UBI, not because I think it's going to solve all these problems, but because it's like, well, here is a way to deal with one of the core material causes of this tension, right? And this is true. I mean, going back to Juice, when you look at a country that's been electrified, they have less violence overall, because you provide for people's needs, and they're not going to feel that desperation, right?
Yes.
And now it doesn't mean that like racism ceases to exist because of electricity. It does mean that you're less likely to have as much racial violence, or even just ethnic violence, whatever, kind of intertribal violence it might be, if you provide for people's material needs. If they're not feeling like they have, a boot on their neck or a gun placed to the back of their head, they're going to feel a lot more forgiving, because they aren't worried about at least their material condition. And I think then, the other aspect of this is, and this is where workism is particularly hard to deal with, because it's also about our spiritual condition, right? And that's something that we need to deal with as well, because workism is kind of about identity. And that's another way that it dovetails with the race conversation, is that, yes, you do have people that, even if unconsciously, their racial identity is the thing that kind of sets them apart. And we're going to have to have something that replaces that, just like we have to have something that replaces the meaning of work for people, right? And what that looks like, I think it's an open conversation, but it's a conversation that we need to have.
Yeah, for sure. I definitely get, we were talking about this earlier, Lacey and I, about this whole idea here is that unfortunately, we do identify our work as who we are. It's giving us value. We're looking at for this transcendence, and that's a message I think that is unhealthy to especially the younger generation. That, follow your passion. Like, this is just going to fulfill you, and we know that that's not the case.
As if work is going to be the thing that gets us to self-actualization. That's the other thing about basic income that's so awesome, is it enables us to free ourselves up to find that self-actualization. And I think like when we move to workism as a religion, which is kind of what we see in this country, we begin to see people who think that is how they self-actualize, through work, through workism. And then they brag that they're like, oh, I just worked 80 hours this week. Isn't that awesome? And I only slept for 2 hours this whole week. And I'm like, no, I actually want to have a work-life balance. No, that's not awesome. And there's so much more that we can live for than just being a means for production and consumption. Absolutely.
Yeah. And I think it's, as our culture has secularized, it's kind of like it's kind of an analogous to the colorblind kind of myth, right? They're like, oh, well, we haven't actually dealt with the root of this yet. We haven't gotten rid of these pernicious cultural beliefs. So we're still living with them, even though we have oh, I'm an atheist now. I don't believe all that stuff. I still act as if I do, though. Mm-hmm. And that's the core thing, is that you can tell what somebody really believes by how they behave. And our culture behaves as if it's still ruled by the God of Calvinism.
Yep.
And we're not really moving past those things on a deeper level, because while we may have decided that going to church isn't for us, or no, of course I'm not racist or whatever, it's but those things are still with us, and they have to be directly confronted. They can't just be, dismissed because they're, no longer cool. They have to be expunged. They have to be, we have to have leadership. And I think that's part of the problem, is that we have kind of a void of leadership.
Yes.
Really taking us in a new direction on these things. And that's one of my frustrations, is that I see a lot of really great conversation about what's wrong with race, but then you see people kind of glom onto the wrong stuff. And I've been critical of the white fragility book, et cetera, because to me, that is all about reinforcing this Puritan, oh, well, it's just about my spiritual condition, you see. I just need, I as a white person just need to realize how white I am. It's well, all you're doing is just subbing in white for sinner, as opposed to, I need to realize that whiteness doesn't exist and blackness doesn't exist in the way that I've been conceiving of it. And we all need to have this collective realization together and move forward. Yeah. And so we are kind of reinforcing those things so we can stay within our comfort zone, while telling ourselves that we've done the work, right? We're not really getting rid of those things because we're not sure what's going to replace it. And we haven't yet had somebody say explicitly, look, I'm challenging you, America. I'm Mr. Person who is running for president. And I have decided to tell you, Americans, you are nothing else. And we haven't really had that yet. And we need to.
I think what we need, and Fromm talks about this in his writings in the 50s, is that we need people who are willing to be creative, to creatively sit down and think about, okay, race is not a real thing. What can we do instead of that? Or what's a different way of thinking about things? And not just with regards to race, but with regards to, the basic income, our work, how we see ourselves as human beings, our human value, our society, culture, all of these things is like you say, I think we do a good job of pointing shit out. We can point shit out, and some people are better at it than others, but we can do that, and we need to do that, because you can't solve a problem you don't know exists, but we got to go beyond that. And I think probably that's why most of us liked Yang so much, because he had solutions, you know what I'm saying? And so I think what I hope we see is people take some more time to think about, what are the solutions? What can we transition to? How can we do this differently? Because we can talk about it till we're blue in the face, but until we have some ideas, and actually it's fun. I mean, Sonya, we've talked about this on the podcast, actually it's actually a creative moment. How can we change things? How can we rethink how we're doing things to make it better for us, to empower us?
Right.
Yeah. And I think it's challenging. I think they're uncomfortable sometimes with these conversations, because we're a culture that likes instant gratification. And so the way that we're sold things is like an antidote. Well, going back to your Calvinistic thing, look at Jody. She got up every morning and she did this on the farm, and she got a 4.0 and she got a great job. So you guys can do this too. Rah, rah,
Right.
And really is, it's not addressing our real issues. And going back to the UBI, I believe that offers a floor. It offers, some kind of base there for us to move ahead. But that challenges us because it goes against the whole workism, the Protestant work ethic, individuals, pull yourself up by your bootstraps.
Yeah, it does. And I think too, I spoke earlier about, critical theory and, social, construction, also social deconstruction, really kind of the point of this postmodernist kind of, philosophical mode that we're in.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that plays to some of our puritanical instincts, because we like criticizing and we like deconstructing. But we only like it so far, because we don't know what it's like to then build something out of that.
Interesting. Yeah.
And it's easier to destroy something than it is to build something. So I think, if you corner a lot of people and they're just like, look, we all know that this is bullshit, right? They're like, oh, well, yeah, of course it is. Right.
Right.
But then the reason why we're still having the same conversation over and over again is because we figured out how to be critical, but not affirmative. We haven't decided to affirm this next thing and be like, this is what we're building, explicitly this, let's move forward together. And that I'm looking forward to, because honestly, I think it's coming. I'm an optimist. I do think that we're moving in that direction, in part because of how much things have been shaken up by this moment in which we are forced to have a reckoning. And I think people don't want to just play out this drama again in a few years in which, like, well, we didn't deal with the root causes of police brutality. Surprise, surprise, it's still happening. People are still getting killed. What did we not do last time, right? Well, we could do that right now. Instead of waiting for 5 years from now, we can look at, well, these are the things that we didn't do last time. Last time we didn't set up a universal basic income. Last time we didn't have a conversation about a transcendent identity. These are the conversations to have right now, because there is no better time to have them.
Yeah, I agree. And I think this is a time, because I'm a little bit involved with political things. I think you're seeing sort of a grassroots, I don't know if I want to call it awakening. There are rumblings of people wanting change. And what's happened is because we've been in crisis. And this is what's had to happen. We've had to really be slammed to have people say, whoa, we need something different. Just to your point, do we want to repeat this in a couple of years? No.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
I mean, I think the pandemic laid a really good foundation for people to be a lot more open to making their voices heard about things, and maybe even being open to things changing, because we've seen our lives change drastically through this year, through 2020. So I think now is as good of time as any to be making these changes. And I'm encouraged. I'm like you, James. I'm an optimist, and I believe we will. And I think Sonya is too. I believe we will really begin to see some of this stuff. I mean, the fact that we, had some type of a stimulus check, I think is a huge win. I think it's a step in the right direction. It's not basic income, but there are people who have the words basic income on their lips who would have never, who said in the, primaries, they weren't going to say anything about basic income.
Right. And we're seeing localism begin to grow for UBI with this move by these mayors. I think it's up to 17 mayors now. It's a lot.
Right.
Yes.
And that is one of the most encouraging things I've seen for UBI, basically since Andrew said he was running. And we're now starting to get to, I mean, I think because of the election, right, it's hard to keep our eye on the ball. But I think things are also going to get a lot worse. So I think we're going to be kind of like you mentioned early on in this recording that, it feels like April again. We kind of feel like we reset to the beginning of the pandemic. Well, I mean, especially here in Texas, because we didn't have like the big wave yet. Yeah, it does feel like it's just beginning again. And so I think people are going to remain shaken up for some time. We should take advantage of that. Like, I don't think that within this window, everything is possible, but I do think that some things are more possible. And, one of those things is definitely the conversation about race and getting rid of it. And the other one is definitely about basic income. I mean, because, and as we discussed, those two things are tied together. It's not a coincidence that we're speaking of them in the same breath. And I think localism really is the key to change. So seeing cities begin to pilot it, because those pilots will work.
Yes.
And they will be well received.
Oh, yeah.
They will change people's lives. And especially in our connected age, because, a lot of these UBI experiments were, pre-internet, or they're in Finland or wherever, right? But in the States, we're going to see more and more people who aren't like Yang Gang people. It wasn't like an issue for them in a presidential election. They're just going to start receiving UBI, and they're going to be like, wait, what? Like, I just feel so much better having this. Just even that little bit, just knowing that it's there makes a huge difference for me. Or people are going to know somebody who's been receiving UBI. And that kind of chain reaction, I still think this is not going to be something that, plays itself out in like tidy timelines of like every major election. It's going to be another, huge referendum on a big idea. But I do think that within this generation, we're going to see a huge movement towards embracing these ideas. And I think we're going to, not just experiments, I think we're going to see cities and counties and states passing UBI and UBI-like laws. And that is going to change things.
Yes.
Because I would love to just like say, oh yeah, well, if we get our guy in as president, it's good, just pulling right down the middle of the lane. But we know it doesn't work like that. You still have to get a bill through. And like by the time it gets through both houses, which who knows who's going to be in charge of those houses, it could be, completely messed up. And it's realistic that you do this the same way that we made gay marriage legal, and the same way that we made, are making marijuana legal, which is like, well, now you have states that are legal.
States, yeah.
And like that, I mean,
cool.
It will trickle up, right? It will absolutely work its way up to the top of the system if we just keep at it.
Yeah, and I think
Go ahead, Sonya.
No, I'm just saying people, I feel, are more empowered when they're working there at the local level, instead of saying the government who's over there. You hear a lot of that negativity.
Right. I love the idea too that we would do it on a local level, like you were saying, like marijuana, like gay marriage, like that makes great sense. And eventually, when everybody sees how awesome and happy the people are in those cities or places, they're going to be like, oh, damn, we need to do this on a federal level. Yeah.
I mean, it's one of those things that I think, you can entice more people to do it because it's kind of a foreign idea and it feels experimental. But if you could just point to a couple places in the US, I mean, like, I know that for a lot of people, just hearing that Alaska has something.
So yeah, when you're ready, I want to take this one.
Questions,
yeah.
Thank you, Anthony. We're going to open up for questions now, guys.
Yeah, let's go and do that before I keep rambling. Yeah.
Well, All right, I'll read it. Do you think it's possible to design policy without taking into account the inequities that have accrued to groups that we've come to identify by race, even if race is just a social construct? Interesting.
I'll let James take that.
I am very much so pro reparations, but I think part of the push for reparations has to be about healing. It's not about fixing the past. It's about creating a better future. It's about, to me, reparations is a way of saying that way. We have treated this group of people, this group of Americans, as if they're not Americans, or at a time as if they weren't even human. And like those things, we can't go back in time and fix, but we can begin to say that, like, look, you are owed inheritance. We can give you that inheritance now and begin to close this wealth gap. And I think two things that go hand in hand to do that are reparations and UBI. UBI is a way to tie the whole group of people together to say that everybody in this society is equal. Everybody is an American. Everybody's a human being. Everybody belongs. If you're receiving UBI and you're a citizen, you belong here, period. Right?
Right.
And I think that will have a profound psychological effect on the whole culture, to look at everybody you see on the street and be like, they're just like me. They're getting X amount of dollars per month, right?
Yeah.
That they are also owed this inheritance. But one of the key ways that I think that African Americans have been disenfranchised is by deliberately having their wealth destroyed. You look at, for example, what happened to Black Wall Street in
Black Wall Street. Mm-hmm.
And this is not an isolated incident. That happened over and over and over again. Right? Any time that you saw African Americans / Afro-Americans, however you want to categorize this group of Americans, begin to acquire wealth and power, it was deliberately taken away from them. We need to be just as deliberate and we're sorry for what this country did to your ancestors, and we can begin to make that right now. But that has to be, it's truth and reconciliation. It's what South Africa did, where we're going to sit down and look each other in the eye and be like, from now on, we are one people. And the only way to do that is to be like, here's what we're going to do, not just say, and not just like pat each other on the back, like, oh, we're all good now, right? Like, we have to make up for the material inequities. And reparations does that for people specifically. And this is something that, like, you know, there's already been a lot of research done into reparations about who should receive it, how much the amount should be, et cetera. This is not something that, like, oh, well, how are you going to pay for it? And, you know, who is going to get it? Like, well, turns out there are answers to those questions. There are reparations bills that exist.
Right.
And it is, in many cases, you know, we know who are the actual descendants of slaves. And no, reparations is not going to solve racism, but reparations is part of this healing process. It's part of this to make it possible for people to play the game of capitalism, this human-centered capitalism that we want to do. Well, you got to have money to do it. And if you don't have any generational wealth, that's what this is about. That's what reparations is about setting the foundation for generational wealth. So just like any other American, which henceforth everybody will be known as, that's the only way to do that. I think that we have to basically have a transition from this period of time that we are in which we are looking at each other through these distorted racial lenses, to a genuinely post-racial society. Yeah, it is possible, but we have to get really gritty about it in the same way that South Africa did. South Africa has not solved all of their racial issues. It will be a continual thing. I mean, it's, you know, was in the 80s and 90s that this process of moving out of apartheid really happened in South Africa. And of course, they're going to be dealing with all of that for a long time. But they were explicit about the starting point of, this is the new society that we are building. We haven't really done that. Even with the civil rights movement, there was still kind of a like, okay, good. You got your civil rights, right? Like there was still like a kind of like, okay, we're moving past it now.
No.
And people justifiably were very angry about that. Because no, we are not past it yet. Because reparations still need to be paid. And we don't have a common sense of Americanness that we have explicitly constructed. And if you can still crack open your census every time it rolls around and check white or black, we are not done.
Right. That's a good point. And I want to piggyback what you're saying. Number one, I don't think we know the history. Like you're saying, it's happened over and over again. The wealth has not allowed to accumulate. And also wealth is more than financial wealth. It's also resources of who you know and education and where you live. So there's many aspects there that I think people aren't aware of.
100%. Yeah. I mean, like there's this classic kind of weaselly thing that you see people say, like, oh, well, the reason why Black Americans are poor is because of the disintegration of Black family. Like, well, it's because the Black family is poor that you have disintegrated families. Look at Hillbillies. This is like Hillbilly Elegy. Like pretty much everybody read that book. It is doing exactly the same process. Any group of people, you disenfranchise them, they disintegrate, period. It's not because there's anything inherent about them. You materially deprive them, and socially they're going to start to fall apart. That's just human nature. That's what happens when you're dealing with that amount of stress. So obviously you relieve the stress, and then magically the family will begin to knit itself back together. Interesting how that works. That's the kind of like common sense approach to wealth. One of the things I like to say is that like wealth is good and we need more of it. We have this weird opposition to just being explicitly pro money, as if it's like, well, money's the root of all evil. Money is the thing that we use to make our society go. Everybody needs the ability to have some go in their engine. You got to be able to get where you need to go in your life. And it doesn't have to be a lot. It just needs to be something. And then that's a start.
Right. And what's interesting is that the idea that Lacey and I always talk about this, that we're interdependent. So this idea that I live in a bubble and what the people next door to me are doing has nothing to do with me is anathema. I mean, obviously, we're all interconnected. And if we bring up those that are near us, we're all of society benefits. But I think that's a concept that's hard here for some reason for people to wrap their heads around.
It goes back to even maybe what James was saying earlier. Like, we're such an independent culture, and based on the Protestant foundations of our country, it's like, it's about what we do. We have to be self-made kind of thing. And the blinders are there to, like, you can't realize that what you're doing affects someone else and vice versa.
Yeah, absolutely.
Okay, we have any more questions? I know someone said something about the wage slavery hashtag. Do you know anything about that, James?
I don't know anything about that. It's difficult because, I mean, I think that wage slavery is basically a thing. Like, I agree with the concept because even though it might seem kind of in poor taste to compare it to, like, I don't know, actual slavery, on the other hand, the psychological effect of it is pretty deleterious. And yeah, you are being coerced. You're absolutely being coerced into, working in many cases, like growing up in Indiana, not a whole lot of opportunity unless you went into pharmaceuticals. So my options were basically go into pharmaceuticals, which is something that I hated the prospect of doing and probably was not going to be good at. I'm not have aptitude for any of that stuff. Or, I just work at some kind of wage job. Maybe if I get lucky, I get a trade or something and I make a decent living. But, for the most part, it's going to be people working these, minimum wage jobs or just above, trying to make it. And yeah, that is a coercive relationship that you have with your employer because they have you by the nuts and they know it, you know it, society knows it, and we're all trying to pretend like that's not the case, right? So that all that being said, I think it's just because of the taste aspect.
How much you want to pay for it, Steven?
Commissions are open, you know where to find me. Anyway, but I think it's the taste aspect, and I think it's hard for people to also defy this social norm that, oh, well, it's not wage slavery. You're just earning your keep, right? You're just doing what you're supposed to do and making $1, because if you don't do that, it's like it's a fair day's work for fair day's pay, blah, 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 blah. That kind of like Norman Rockwell-esque Americana, dyed in the wool sense of this is just what you got to do. It feels hippy dippy to point out that that's obviously crap. But yeah, it is obviously crap. And everybody is like, it's all over. Like, I notice it all the time in like every form of media that I consume. There's always a story about like, man, I just can't live working the same job for the rest of my life. Like, everybody knows it's crap, right?
Yeah.
But we all kind of pretend like it's not.
Such cognitive dissonance there,
Right.
just like many other things in our lives, I'm doing great. Not really. I'm depressed. Like that's what we tell people, but not in reality.
I was going to shout out a few people that commented when we were talking. There was Van Dorenal, and she or he said that shouldn't we read the Bible more as spiritually rather than literally? And I think that's, obviously there's a difference of opinion there. Something that Lacey and I talk a lot about spirituality, but as we know, many denominations are reading it literally. So.
Yeah, and it's kind of the issue with it is, like I alluded to earlier, that it is a Rorschach test. Like, I mean, look at the number of cults that have based themselves on the Bible. I mean, like saying you're Bible-based is kind of saying nothing.
Okay, interesting. Yeah,
that's my issue with it. But at the same time, honestly, going back to like my personal backstory, the reason why I ended up having this kind of moment of disagreement with the staff at this ministry school and then walking away was not because I felt like I didn't believe anymore. It's because I believed too much that truth really mattered and that truths were universal and were actually attainable and you could actually get there. But to me, there's another book that I want to plug.
Okay. Awesome.
Sorry. See, Steve, you're wearing out my voice. I'm sorry, I can't take any questions right now. Is the sacredness of questioning everything. So this is a book by a guy named David Dark, who is he's a English teacher and he is a Christian, and it was this explicitly Christian defense of questioning everything. And I read that book when I was 17, and it changed my life because I had always kind of intuitively felt, there it is, boom, on the money. Thank you, Victor.
So awesome.
Thank you.
You're the best.
And that, I mean, like, I love that it's in that line right there. Is your God big enough to be questioned? And that to me was the crux of the whole thing. This idea that like doubt was the enemy, that any lack of confidence or total moral clarity was the enemy. Well, he flipped that on his head and said that like, if God is this ever patient being, and if truth and God are the same, then God isn't afraid of questions. He invites you to question. Because the more you question, the more you doubt, the more you seek, the more you're skeptical, the more you just kind of try to poke into the mysteries of the universe, the closer you'll get to God. And that to me felt like, well, then obviously anybody who does that anywhere is going to be opening themselves to the truth and possibly even to God. And like, to me, like, I don't consider myself an atheist. Agnostic something or other. Like, I have a Buddha as my profile picture right now because I basically consider myself a Buddhist. But it's because I felt that, truth was available for anybody who was seeking it. And I think there's truths in the Bible. And so in some sense, I agree with Vaughn that like, you do want to be reading it spiritually, but you want to be careful with that at the same time, because the Bible isn't a spiritual object unlike everything else. It's that the Bible, like everything else, is a spiritual object. And so if you want to find truth, you need to look at everything. You want to look at other religious traditions. You want to look within yourself. You want to look in nature. You want to look in science. Because, I mean, to me, I still believe that if you seek, you will find. I still believe that. I still believe that that process, which is a biblical truth, it is available to anybody. But I don't think that means that the Bible has a unique authority. That's the thing that I've since come to reject, because like, to me, that squares the importance of the Bible to me spiritually. And also the fact that I know that the truth is that the Bible was written by fallible humans. It was edited. It's been distilled. It was canonically put together by a group of people who voted on it. And there were some books that just didn't quite make the cut. Like, the more you look into the history of how the Bible was constructed, the less certain you are that the Bible is just like a perfect God-given document. Of course it isn't.
Right.
But just like with everything else, there are absolutely important truths in it that are worth listening to and they're worth learning from. And, for me, it's just like, it's opened up a door for me to explore all these other religions and to find value in them. And I'm not afraid of doing that, because I don't think that if, there is a personal God, that he would be afraid of me doing that either.
Right. Absolutely. We don't have the, we're not the only ones with the answers. I know when Lacey and I did our last podcast, we talked about Master Eckhart. He also talks about actually letting go of God, just letting go of all these ideas to allow the truth to come in. So follows what you're saying.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. What's up, Meta Jawbone? If you believe race is a social construct, don't you need broad consensus to also believe that in order to achieve the society you want?
The answer is yes, obviously. Yeah, that's the reason why this is so hard, right? And that's why we need leadership. We need people shifting the window on this and being like, no, race is bad. Stop believing in it. But we don't, like, we have people kind of tiptoeing up to that a lot. And we'll even have people saying like, oh, race is a fiction, race is a social construct. Everybody nods along as if they agree. But then we don't do explicit,
Right.
We don't explicitly say, oh, but we're getting rid of this and replacing it with this, because I think that requires the more difficult thing, which is, it's consensus building. It's saying, what kind of people do we want to be together? And that's something that we're going to have to move toward. And I can already see his next question. You should go and throw that one up. And I think in the meantime, we got to do what James Baldwin did. We got to do what the Fields did, writing Racecraft. And that is, we have to decide for ourselves that this is a thing that we oppose. And this is the society they want to move towards. It's kind of like how long it's taken for our culture to secularize. And we're really kind of still going through that of like, waking up to all of these different theological constructs that we have embraced, including workism. That's going to be an ongoing process. I mean, cultures change very slowly. And I'm confident that we can get there as long as we have leadership and people taking those risks, because it is risky. Like, hell, I even feel, even though I know that I have really smart people backing me up on these points, I still feel like I'm taking on a personal risk talking about race like this, because that's usually framed in this way of being like, you know what, this has got to go.
No, this is good.
But it's something that more people are going to have to be explicit about for us to move forward. And then we're just going to keep, kind of cutting through that rock like a river. Like, it's a stream today, it'll be a river tomorrow.
Yeah. I mean, we could have said that a year ago about basic income. Like, how can we get basic income out? It's just not, but you have to do something, and you have to trust that when you do the something else is going to happen. Something else is going to happen. Something else is going to happen. And at some point, the river just busts wide open, and, you make the progress that you really need to make.
Yeah. 100%.
Yeah. Well, James, it has been such a pleasure to have you on. Thank you. Like, I don't know about Sonya, but I know I've learned a ton.
Sure.
I
know we can talk about these subjects for hours and hours, like we do.
Yeah, but it's great to get another perspective about how we can rethink the way we are doing our humanity. And we appreciate your time, man, and we appreciate you being here.
Well, I really appreciate you having me. This was a lot of fun. So, yeah, cool. I will. I'll be around. You know where to reach me.
Yeah, we love the book recommendations because we're big book readers.
Check out James. Follow James on Twitter. Also, check out his podcast. It's really good. And you got to watch Juice, guys. You got to watch Juice. It's so good. So best of luck to you, James, with everything else you have going on. And, of course, we'll be in touch.
All right. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
All right. And thanks to Victor for being awesome with all the everything, all the fun things that popped up on the screen.
Thank you, Victor. You were on the money.
All right, guys. Have a great night.
Thanks.